Today's tale will transport listeners far into the past, not to magnificent marble palaces or to thunderous lightning cleaving the skies, but to ancient myths that once resonated beneath shimmering stars. It will turn to the feats, the legends, and the long winding fate of a man who, possessing incredible power, was at the same time lost, full of imperfections and profoundly, piercingly human. This narrative will not be a dazzling ode to glory proclaimed from mountain peaks. Rather, it will unfold a story of unbearable burden, titanic effort, and unbreakable resilience, of that subtle yet true heroism born from simply and stubbornly continuing along one's chosen path. May these quiet yet profound legends find an echo in the depths of every soul listening now. So, as the world around dims its bright lights, and thoughts allow themselves to slow their pace, listeners are invited to delve into the very beginning of a myth whose ancient wisdom still retains its astonishing relevance today. Prepare yourselves, for before you a story will unfold that, despite millennia, still has the power to captivate. The beginning will be gentle, like an ancient dawn, for we are about to plunge into a tradition as old as the temples themselves and the first twilight of humanity. This is a story lost in the countless folds of myth, artfully embroidered with the silk of ancient superstitions and, as is often the case with human tales, lightly dusted with the imprints of eternal confusion. Before the listeners will appear the tale of Heracles, or, if one prefers the Roman style, Hercules. But there is no need to rush, for the journey will be long. After all, no one has ever stormed Olympus upon waking. This story does not begin in the boundless heavens, but on earth, in the city of Thebes. Though even this name is shrouded in the familiar mist of mythological uncertainty, concealing the true outlines of the past. In those very Thebes lived a mortal woman named Alcmene. She was of noble lineage, possessed a patient disposition, and crucially for subsequent events, was married. Her husband, Amphitryon, was away at war, a circumstance in Greek mythology that always served as a kind of open window during an approaching storm, foreshadowing the inevitable intrusion of something unforeseen. And into this breach Zeus enters, or rather, Zeus himself, the lord of the gods, descends. This Zeus, hurler of storms, with his flowing beard, tireless pursuer of nymphs, whose marital fidelity could only be described as a rather abstract concept, could not stay away. Zeus became inflamed with passion for Alcmene, and the reason was paradoxical, not because she sought divine attention or company, but precisely because she did not seek it at all. And this, as Greek myth tells us, was practically an unconscious invitation for an almighty god. Great Zeus, resorting to his divine power, took on the likeness of Amphitryon, returning from war earlier than expected, and spent the night with Alcmene. Moreover, he stretched that night into 3, manipulating the very flow of time as only a thunder god could, which, even by divine standards, seemed an excessive display of his whim. Alcmene, unsuspecting, was convinced she was spending time with her husband, and thus the fateful seed was sown from which a demigod was to grow. The next morning, as the sun had already risen above the horizon, the real Amphitryon arrived in Thebes. Naturally, Alcmene found herself in a state of deep confusion and embarrassment. Amphitryon, in turn, was also considerably puzzled when his wife congratulated him on their romantic evening, which of course he had not yet had. Eventually, the truth unravelled like a poorly spun thread, exposing the whole unpleasant situation. And as might be expected, this incident displeased quite a few, but no one as much as the goddess Hera. Ah yes, Hera, the majestic queen of Olympus, the lawful wife of Zeus, known for her patience, discerning gaze, and quite understandably, untamed fury. However, her wrath rarely found its true target, almost never falling upon Zeus himself. Instead, it relentlessly descended upon the innocent women her husband pursued, and upon the children born from these celestial transgressions. And in this case all her fury fell directly upon the unborn Heracles, foretelling a destiny full of trials for him. Now it is appropriate to pause briefly to delve into historical context. Ancient Greeks held the belief that their gods were not omnipotent in the absolute sense that later religions would describe divinity. The Olympians undoubtedly possessed immense power and influence, but they also had numerous human flaws, pettiness, all-consuming jealousy, and notably a disheartening lack of conflict resolution skills. In essence, their existence resembled a grand divine soap opera, and Hera played her role with unparalleled theatrical flair and drama. When news of Alcmene's pregnancy reached Hera, she did not merely seethe in silent indignation. No, her goal was to completely prevent Heracles' birth. She convinced her daughter Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to postpone Alcmene's labour indefinitely. Poor Alcmene found herself trapped in endless agonizing contractions, experiencing a tormenting magical stalemate, seemingly without end. Fortunately, her resourceful maid Galanthis managed to deceive Eileithyia by loudly shouting that the child had already been born, which startled the goddess and forced her to loosen her spell. And thus, through cunning and deceit, Heracles finally came into the world, casting his first challenge to his powerful adversary. From his very birth, he was anything but an ordinary child. First, he was incredibly huge for an infant. It was said that tiny Heracles possessed strength comparable to many adult men, and an appetite capable of feeding a small army, a rather inconvenient and even terrifying combination for a baby's cradle. Hera, still intent on destroying his existence, devised a new, more insidious plan. One night, she sent 2 venomous snakes directly into his cradle. This was intended to be a quiet, unnoticed assassination, but the infant, as ancient myth tells, grabbed a snake in each of his tiny yet already incredibly strong hands and strangled them. When his nurse returned to the room, she found the baby purring contentedly, with 2 snakes hanging lifelessly in his hands, like discarded, tiresome toys, foreshadowing future feats and endless struggle. This story of the infant strangling snakes is one of the earliest recorded episodes in the extensive cycle of Heracles myths. Its echoes can be found in both vase painting and early classical literature. For example, an amphora dating to approximately 520 BC depicts young Heracles with exaggerated ease, clutching the snakes, while the surrounding figures are frozen in genuine horror and astonishment. Modern scholars suggest that this tradition served a dual purpose for the ancient Greeks. It not only entertained the masses, but also vividly demonstrated the hero's divine, superhuman strength, evident even in his cradle. Beyond this, the story set a somber and majestic tone for all that was to come in his life. Heracles' existence, from his infancy to his ultimate apotheosis, would be a long, arduous balancing act between unexpected divine favor and cruel divine punishment. He was simultaneously loved and hated, blessed and cursed, an ideal embodiment of mythological contradiction, foreshadowing the dramatic development of his fate. Heracles was not the only child in the family. Soon after his birth, Alcmene bore another son, Iphicles, this time by her lawful husband, Amphitryon. Thus, two boys grew up in the house simultaneously, outwardly similar but essentially only partial twins, one of divine origin, the other an ordinary mortal. One can only imagine how awkward and full of hidden tensions family dinners might have been in such an unusual household. Iphicles, though a brave and noble man in his own right, inevitably always existed in the formidable and all-consuming shadow of his demigod brother. The ancient Greeks, always deeply fond of metaphors and symbolism, skillfully used this duality of the brothers for a profound exploration of fundamental themes such as fate, lineage, and the constantly blurred, uncertain boundaries between man and God. Now let us move to Heracles' childhood and youth, a period when his boisterous and mighty spirit was formed. During this time he was taught by the best and wisest minds in all of Greece. The wise and surprisingly gentle centaur Chiron, a renowned mentor of heroes, instructed him in the fundamentals of medicine and the art of music. Linus, a strict and demanding music teacher, attempted to instill in the youth the skill of playing the lyre, which was considered a standard and integral part of noble education in that era. Unfortunately, Heracles showed very little patience for musical scales and even less for corrections of his mistakes. When Linus, in an attempt to guide him, struck his pupil for an error, Heracles, without hesitation, retaliated by striking his mentor with the very lyre. The incident ended tragically. Linus died, and Heracles was sent into exile for murder. Greek legends, as is well known, are full of such educational failures, where the untamed temper of heroes clashed with discipline. Despite this early tragic setback and exile, Heracles continued to grow steadily in his incredible strength and majestic stature. He fearlessly hunted fierce lions, engaged in battles with wild centaurs, and performed such feats that would put any most grueling modern gym workout regime to shame. One of his particularly early and impressive deeds involved defeating a huge lion that was devastating the fertile plains of Cithaeron, terrorizing the local inhabitants. After this victory, he began to wear its skin, that very mighty fur which in later tales was often mistakenly confused with the hide of the legendary Nemean lion. Heracles was also known for his insatiable appetite, not only for abundant food but for life experience in all its manifestations. He drank from the cup of life deeply and eagerly, often causing alarm and concern among those around him. One of the many anecdotes tells of how he single-handedly devoured an entire prepared banquet, even before the other invited guests arrived. Whether this was true or merely a vivid exaggeration matters not, for such stories only reinforced his image as a being transcending ordinary life in every possible sense, shaping the myth of his boundless strength and insatiability. However, despite all his power and grandeur, Heracles was not without deep flaws. His temper, in particular, was both legendary in its fury and extremely dangerous to all around him. This fatal flaw plagued him throughout his long and turbulent life. The most tragic and heartbreaking result of this flaw manifested in his early adulthood. Hera, tireless and ever-patient strategist in her hatred, struck again, but this time not with venomous snakes, but through all-consuming madness. One day, under her cruel influence, Heracles completely lost all sense of reality. In a fit of madness, blinded by darkness, he killed his gentle wife, Megara, and their innocent children. The grief when he finally regained his senses and realized the horror of what he had done was truly overwhelming and unbearable. He sought redemption, and the only way known to the ancient Greeks for this was purification through unbearable suffering. At the Delphic oracle, he prayed for guidance, for a path to forgiveness. The Pythia, the priestess through whom Apollo himself spoke, commanded him to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns and perform a series of truly unthinkable feats. These tasks were so immense and complex that they were considered almost impossible for any mortal. Only through this atonement, through these inhuman trials, could Heracles cleanse the terrible stain of his past and perhaps achieve long-awaited immortality. But this great and tragic story of his labours is a subject for another, no less captivating chapter. If we turn to the historical aspect, the ancient Greeks did not simply invent the figure of Heracles out of thin air. It is quite likely that he originated as a revered hero as early as the mysterious Mycenaean times. His name, recorded as Heracles, appears on linear B tablets dating back to the Bronze Age, attesting to his ancient roots. Over the centuries, his legend steadily expanded and transformed, adapting to the changing needs and values of each new generation. In the 5th century BC, Athenian dramatists, for example, depicted him as a deeply tragic figure whose fate was full of suffering. At the same time, the Romans later transformed him into a powerful symbol of imperial strength. Yet he was not only revered, but actively worshipped. Not only were fascinating stories told about him in taverns or majestic epics composed, but he was also honoured in sanctuaries. Altars were erected in his honour, and lavish festivals were held. The cult of Heracles had real, devoted followers, who left offerings in temples, prayed to him for protection, and even held athletic games in his honour. The Olympic Games themselves, though officially dedicated to Zeus, sometimes included tributes to Heracles as the mythical founder of these athletic contests. The figure of Heracles also frequently appears in Etruscan art, where he was usually called Hercules. His image served as a kind of bridge between various mythologies, adopted, reinterpreted, and adapted throughout the ancient Mediterranean. He became an enduring model of a strong man who ultimately triumphs over all adversity and suffering, a theme that resonated deeply in people's hearts for countless centuries and continues to inspire to this day. Thus, we draw a line under this part of the narrative where, in essence, it all began. At the cradle, where, as an infant, he strangled snakes, never knowing true peace. Born of gods but raised among ordinary mortals, Heracles, from the first days of his life, was the embodiment of a paradox. Clad in incredible musculature and ancient prophecy, he was destined to fight terrifying monsters, descend into the dark depths of the underworld, and eventually meet his death in agony on a funeral pyre. But that is yet to come. For now he sleeps, as we hope, do you. Let us continue our tale, but not in the radiance of glory, but in the shadow of deep sorrow. For before Heracles ascended to the title of the most celebrated hero on earth, he was to endure a crushing fall, tragic, public, and deeply personal. This chapter, dear listener, opens with madness. Divine madness, to be precise, the kind that steals upon you not with the rustling of falling leaves or ominous rumbles on the horizon, but with the faint whisper of a goddess whose heart was overflowing with a long-held, furious grudge. At the moment we last observed Heracles, he had already become a figure of outstanding magnitude, both in mythological legacy and physical strength. His power was unprecedented, his appetite legendary, and at banquets, his beard seemed to do most of the talking. He had married Megara, Princess of Thebes, and, for the most part, had settled into the measured domestic rhythm of a noble life. Perhaps even, dare we suggest, finding a semblance of happiness. Such a state of affairs, of course, was completely unacceptable to Hera. The Queen of Olympus, still tormented by agonizing memories of her husband Zeus's numerous extramarital affairs, which constantly begat demigods, bided her time. Hera never forgot anything, and, it must be admitted, never forgave anything. Soon she delivered her next crushing blow. This time she did not resort to snakes or intricate magic spells. She used madness, the most insidious of all divine instruments. One moment Heracles was completely at peace. The next, his world turned into an unbearable, constantly shifting nightmare. Hera plunged Heracles into the abyss of madness. Temporary, yes, but no less destructive for it. In his confusion and raging fury, he mistook his own wife and children for his deadliest enemies. What followed was not a battle, it was a terrifying slaughter. By the time he regained his senses, the palace had fallen silent. His family was gone. The horror of what he had done broke his spirit. And so the most powerful man in all of Greece fell not on the battlefield, but in his own home. He fell not by an enemy's spear, but by a divine whisper of a curse. The ancient Greeks called this Arta, an all-consuming, destructive madness sent by the gods themselves. It was not merely misfortune, but a moment of divine retribution. It seemed even the greatest heroes were not immune to such a terrible collapse. Let us pause here, as the ancient Greeks often did, to consider the profound implications of this myth. This was not merely tragedy in the usual sense. It was moral retribution, a kind of cosmic balancing of justice. The Greeks firmly believed in miasma, the defilement of the soul after committing such monstrous deeds. Heracles, defiled by his crime, could not simply continue living as if nothing had happened. No lavish feast, no heartfelt prayer, not even the deepest apologies could erase such a terrible stain from his soul. He needed deep purification, and purification for a Greek hero was never easy or painless. He set out, broken and barefoot, to sacred Delphi, where the Pythia, Apollo's oracle, sat, shrouded in clouds of smoke and deep mystery. It was she, through divine inspiration, who prescribed his remedy: slavery. Specifically, Heracles was to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns for 12 long years. Eurystheus, it must be said, was far from the kind of person one would want to encounter in a moment of personal crisis. Small in stature, but with an inordinately inflated ego, and perhaps too fond of lying idly while others toiled, Eurystheus was Heracles' petty cousin, and thanks to a bizarre twist of fate, as well as a small but crucial intervention by Hera, it was Eurystheus, not Heracles, who inherited the throne of Mycenae. Being forced to serve this very man was a humiliation in itself, but that was the whole point. The Greek idea of catharsis, or purification, had nothing to do with maintaining dignity. It was about humility, suffering, and a slow, agonizing ascent back to honor. Thus were born the famous 12 labors. But before we proceed to list these deeds, full of power and misfortune, let us linger here a little longer, because this chapter, this fall into the abyss of madness, is truly foundational. It reveals to us that Heracles was not merely a character embodying brute physical strength. He was a man who was deeply flawed, who fully experienced the consequences of his actions, and who had to earn his place not by birthright, but through arduous trials, blood, and sweat. Megara, by the way, is a figure too often lost in the shadow of her husband's grand legend. In some versions of the myth, she was saved from the massacre, living thereafter in exile, or retreating to her father's realm. In others, her fate was final and tragic. Greek mythology, true to its oral tradition roots, is not a single monolithic narrative, but rather a complex tapestry, frayed, tangled, and interwoven over many generations. Heracles' crime is reflected in Euripides' tragedy, Heracles, a dark and powerful play that explores not only madness itself, but also its crushing, long-term consequences. In it, Heracles returns from the underworld only to find his family threatened by a tyrant. He saves them, but then immediately goes mad, killing those he had just snatched from danger. When he regains his senses, he contemplates suicide. It is his loyal friend Theseus who convinces him to live on, but not as a god, but as a man who must endure and overcome. This theme, endurance, fortitude, is key. Greek heroes were not saints in our understanding, nor were they meant to be. Instead, they served as mirrors, reflecting the human struggle in general. True courage was not in the absence of failure or falling. It was in the willingness to rise again after every defeat. And what about her, Hera? Certainly it's tempting to see her as an absolute villain, and in the context of Heracles' life, she certainly appears to be an antagonist. But Hera also has her own deep context here. In a world where divine men pursued mortal women with alarming frequency, suffering no serious consequences, her wrath represented a kind of divine protest. Misdirected, yes, misguided, certainly, but perhaps also the only weapon available to a queen in a court where thunderous and immense egos reigned. The theme of divine madness as an instrument of punishment was deeply rooted in ancient Greek thought. Even beyond mythology, historical records mention dreams, visions, and sudden fits of madness as forms of divine intervention. In this case, Hera uses the very fabric of Heracles' mind, not just to destroy his family, but to plunge him into a lifelong cycle of guilt and atonement. There are visual echoes of this moment in ancient Greek pictorial art. A particularly striking red figure crater from the 5th century BC depicts Heracles in a wild, almost ecstatic frenzy. His face is distorted, weapons are brandished, he is surrounded by fallen figures. Scholars debate whether this depicts this exact episode, but the intensity of the emotion, the divine storm raging within him, is unmistakable. His descent into madness also draws comparisons to other mythical figures. Ajax the Great, for example, another hero who succumbs to madness and kills livestock, mistaking them for his enemies. When he realizes the terrible truth, he takes his own life. But Heracles, despite all his unthinkable suffering, chooses the harder path, the path of life. After consulting at Delphi, Heracles fully submitted to his fate. The next 12 years of his life would be defined not by his noble birth, not by his ambitions, but by his obedience to a cousin who couldn't even lift his lion skin if he tried. The irony of this situation undoubtedly would not have been lost on the ancient Greeks. It was meant to sting his pride. Heracles was not sent to war or handed a sword for great deeds. He was handed a list, the labours that would follow, killing, delivering, cleaning, capturing. Each contained its own trap, its bitter bite. Some were designed to humiliate him, others to kill him, and all were intended to break his spirit. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In fact, there is a faint but curious echo of this ancient structure in modern literature and cinema. The hero who falls, self-exile, the slow and agonizing path to redemption. From Arthurian knights to Shakespearean kings, from comic book titans to tragic anti-heroes, this pattern still actively exists, and it so often begins with a fall not in battle, but from within, from the very soul of the hero. Even in early Christian traditions which emerged significantly later, one can find echoes of Heracles' path. The idea that redemption is earned through suffering, that true strength lies not only in power but also in humility, in endurance, in serving others. Later worship of Heracles often emphasized precisely this redemptive path. In sanctuaries in places like Thebes and Thasos, votive offerings often included miniature clubs and lion skin, symbols not only of his strength, but also of the trials he overcame. Pilgrims prayed not for an easy life, but for the strength to endure hardships like Heracles. His myth also inspired the Stoics of the Roman period. The philosopher Seneca often referred to Heracles not as brute force, but as an outstanding moral figure, one who suffered nobly, who bore pain with dignity, and who showed that virtue could ultimately triumph even over divine malice. So, if by this point of the night your eyes have grown heavy and silence has fallen in the room, let us leave Heracles in this moment of stillness. His past lies in ruins, his path is unclear, his sandals are covered in dust, the horizon is distant, but not impossible. Labours await, and perhaps sleep as well. Let us now return to this crossroads of fate, where Heracles, cloaked in deep guilt and burdened by divine command, is about to embark on what is perhaps the most famous list of deeds in mythological history, the 12 Labours of Heracles, epic in their scope, incredible in their details, and astonishingly specific. Each is a trial, each a punishment, and each woven into the grand tapestry of his atonement. The story of Heracles' labours begins with his extraordinary position. The great hero was destined to serve the powerful king Eurystheus, ruler of Tiryns, but not as a respected guest or noble relative, but as a mere subject. Moreover, his role went beyond ordinary servitude. Heracles found himself doomed to perform the most arduous, humiliating, and at times frankly absurd tasks that could possibly occur to a monarch. These legendary deeds in essence represented a form of bureaucratic reckoning, seasoned with poetic irony. They symbolized atonement through a series of seemingly impossible assignments. The very first trial that befell the hero was the Nemean lion. This was not merely a beast of colossal size. It was distinguished by absolute invulnerability. The predator's golden hide was so dense that it could not be pierced by sharp arrows, steel blades, or powerful spears. The inhabitants of the surrounding lands had long resigned themselves to periodically becoming prey for this monster. Heracles, armed only with his trusty club and sharp mind, headed straight for the lion's lair. Quickly realizing the futility of using conventional weapons, he engaged the beast without any tools, ultimately overpowering it with his own strength and strangling it. Subsequently, displaying astonishing ingenuity, Heracles used the lion's own claw to skin it. From that day on, this hide served him as reliable armor, a choice of attire that was both deeply symbolic and terrifying. The lion's skin, elegantly draped over his mighty shoulders, with the mane forming a kind of hood, was forever enshrined in classical art and sculpture as one of the most recognizable elements of his image. The next trial confronting the hero was the Lernaean Hydra. This monster was a multi-headed water serpent, the number of whose heads, according to various traditions, ranged from 9 upwards. Its most disheartening feature was that for every head cut off, 2 new ones immediately grew back. In addition, this creature lived in a foul swamp near Lerna, and its breath was mortally poisonous. Heracles began his attack using a sword and fire, while his loyal nephew promptly cauterized the neck stumps, preventing them from regenerating. Clearly, even in heroic endeavors, coordinated teamwork is an invaluable quality. Hera, looking on with displeasure from the heights of Olympus, was so annoyed by the hero's success that she summoned a giant crab to aid the Hydra. However, even this divine intervention proved futile. Heracles easily crushed the crustacean. Later, in a gesture of recognition, albeit an ironic one, the gods ascended both monsters to the heavens, transforming them into constellations. For even minor participation of divine forces, it seems, deserves immortalization on the star atlas. The third trial, unlike the previous ones, was significantly less spectacular. This was the Ceryneian hind, a deer with magnificent golden antlers, revered as a sacred animal of the goddess Artemis, and possessing incredible speed, surpassing the flight of any arrow. Heracles was strictly forbidden to harm it in any way. Therefore he embarked on a year-long pursuit, tirelessly following it on foot, crossing dense forests, traversing high mountains, and fording turbulent rivers. After 12 months, he finally managed to catch it with extreme caution and explained the situation to Artemis herself. The goddess, to everyone's surprise, allowed him to temporarily take the hind, but with the indispensable condition to return it safe and sound. This episode is a prime example not so much of destructive force as of diplomatic skill, reminding us that not every heroic deed must end in bloodshed. It also elegantly demonstrated Heracles' unyielding perseverance. After all, it is not often that one encounters an adversary who must be defeated not in battle, but through an exhausting chase and cunning. Next in the series of labours was the Erymanthian boar. This ferocious creature terrorized the surrounding villages, mercilessly uprooting mighty trees and ruthlessly tossing unfortunate farmers. Heracles, displaying not only strength but also cunning, managed to catch it by cleverly driving it into deep snowdrifts. This was another eloquent example of how a sharp mind can harmoniously combine with formidable physical power. Upon the hero's return to Tiryns, King Eurystheus was so consumed by panic at the sight of the captured boar that he hastily hid in a huge clay jar. This comical episode, depicted on many ancient ceramic pieces, with undisguised humour, reminds us that even in heroic sagas there is room for farce. The image of Eurystheus hiding in a pythos, a large clay vessel, became a favourite subject and a running joke in Athenian vase painting. one involuntarily wonders how such a timid ruler could even manage his kingdom. The fifth labor proved to be an exceedingly repulsive task, cleaning the Augean stables. King Augeas owned countless herds of immortal cattle, and his stables had remained uncleaned for many decades. The result, as one can easily imagine, was, to put it mildly, extremely malodorous. Heracles, demonstrating astonishing ingenuity, diverted the courses of 2 mighty rivers to clean these colossal stalls in just one day. Unfortunately, because he had previously negotiated a reward for his labor, King Eurystheus declared this feat invalid. Apparently, divine atonement was not subject to commercialization. Nevertheless, this deed marked an important turning point. Heracles now appeared, not only as the embodiment of brute force, but also as a skilled engineer. This particular labor, centuries later, was cited by Roman authors as a prime example of using natural forces to solve complex problems. The sixth labor was the expulsion of the Stymphalian birds. These creatures were by no means ordinary feathered beings. They possessed feathers of metal that could be hurled like arrows and emitted a piercing cry capable of shattering glass. Heracles, having received a set of bronze castanets from the goddess Athena herself, used them to deafen and flush the birds into the air, and then methodically shot them down with his arrows. The chosen solution was both spectacular and extremely effective. Subsequently, this scene was often depicted in ancient mosaics and temple friezes, where Heracles is captured in the midst of shooting, surrounded by a whirlwind of these extraordinary birds. Let us allow ourselves a brief respite in this captivating narrative. By this stage of his saga, Heracles has already irrefutably demonstrated not only his colossal physical power, but also an astonishing capacity for adaptation. He skillfully resolves the most complex tasks, using both brute muscle force and a sharp analytical mind, resorting to fire or even music, displaying a perseverance that can be called truly philosophical. Each of his completed tasks imprinted a new, unique mark on his mythological image, be it the invulnerable golden hide, the unwavering loyalty of his nephew, or even the unexpected interaction with the forces of nature, as in the case of the rivers. The seventh of the heroic deeds was the taming of the Cretan bull. This was a majestic but at the same time incredibly fierce creature, sent by Poseidon himself. However, King Minos, displaying flagrant disrespect, refused to sacrifice it, which, undoubtedly, was extremely bad form, especially when dealing with sea deities. Heracles engaged the bull in combat, and after overcoming it, sent it to Eurystheus, who, in turn, immediately released it, which, of course, is common practice when dealing with sacred animals. Some traditions assert that this very bull would later play a key role in the myth of the Minotaur, a narrative which, like many Greek tales, intricately intertwines with itself, like a skillfully baked spanakopita. The eighth trial involved the mares of Diomedes. These animals were truly bloodthirsty and possessed cannibalistic tendencies. Heracles managed to subdue them by feeding them their own cruel master, Diomedes. The mares, perhaps stunned by such a radical change in diet, suddenly became completely docile. If one sets aside the ethical dilemma of such a solution, the method proved surprisingly effective. The horses were safely led away. In some versions of the myth, the mares were even taken to Mount Olympus as a gift, though one might assume the gods had rather mixed feelings about such an unusual offering. The ninth assignment at first glance seemed almost civilized. to obtain the girdle of Hippolyta. Hippolyta was the queen of the Amazons and possessed a wondrous girdle, a gift from Ares, the god of war himself. Initially, she showed willingness to give it freely. However, Hera, ever hostile to the hero, once again intervened in events. Disguised as an Amazon, she spread false rumors that Heracles intended to abduct their queen. A bloody battle ensued. Hippolyta fell, and Heracles still took the girdle. What could have ended in a simple and peaceful transaction turned into a tragic misunderstanding, one of many on his arduous path. The Amazons, in turn, became a significant and recurring image in Greek traditions. They were both feared and admired, for they embodied warrior women from a world where power took on a completely different, feminine form. 10th on the list of heroic accomplishments were the cattle of Geryon. Geryon, a three-bodied giant residing at the westernmost edge of the then-known world, presented a significant obstacle. Heracles was to journey far beyond civilized lands, perhaps as far as modern-day Iberia, to retrieve his herd. In the course of this distant journey, he erected the famous Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, to commemorate his passage. The hero defeated Geryon, stole his cattle, and traversed the boundless wilderness. At one point, unable to bear the scorching heat, he audaciously shot an arrow at the sun itself. Surprisingly, the sun god Helios, instead of punishing him, admired such boldness and granted him a golden cup on which to sail the sea. It's curious how many sun gods nowadays reward accurate archery with such unusual maritime transport. This myth is a fine example of a narrative that skillfully balances on the edge between the majestic and the absurd, perhaps even with a certain intent. The 11th assignment, requiring exceptional cunning, involved the golden apples of the Hesperides. These precious fruits were guarded by gentle nymphs and a formidable dragon, and their whereabouts were unknown even to Heracles himself. In search of a solution, he first sought advice from Prometheus, and then managed to persuade the Titan Atlas to fetch the apples, while Heracles temporarily took on his unbearable burden, supporting the celestial vault. When Atlas attempted to permanently shirk his eternal burden, Heracles, through cunning, forced him to take up the load again. This was one of the rare moments when brute force alone was insufficient. Clearly, holding up the heavens required not only muscles but also a considerable amount of wit. In numerous artworks, Heracles is often depicted literally holding the heavens on his shoulders. No small feat, even for one who once strangled a lion with his bare hands. And finally, the 12th, concluding labour, was the capture of Cerberus, the terrifying three-headed hound of Hades, the sleepless guardian of the underworld. Heracles dared to descend into the gloomy realm of the dead, where he managed to make an agreement with the Lord Hades himself and bring Cerberus to the surface of the earth without resorting to weapons. After the demonstration, the formidable monster was, according to the terms of the agreement, returned to the underworld. This grandiose task, involving crossing the boundary between life and death, and subsequently returning, elevated Heracles beyond ordinary mortals. He ceased to be merely a hero. Now he became a figure who had challenged death itself, and emerged victorious from that struggle, roaring and leading his unusual companion to finally complete his atonement. With the completion of this last deed, the great labours of Heracles finally came to their logical conclusion. 12 tasks, each monstrous and incredibly difficult in its own way, collectively formed a mythological resume unparalleled in the ancient world. But beyond their grandeur, these trials carried deep meaning. By performing them, Heracles not only atoned for his crime, but also cleansed himself of oppressive rage, excessive pride, and unbearable grief. He proved that the impossible could be accomplished not once, but 12 times. And through all these trials, he rose not just as a hero, but as a figure worthy of the deepest reverence. In the cultural context of ancient Greece, these stories were not merely entertaining tales. They served as powerful metaphors for life's difficulties, its chaos, its inner monsters, and its inevitable misunderstandings. And Heracles, through his courage and cunning, demonstrated that even those who are cursed can find a path to redemption. Subsequently, the deeds of Heracles featured prominently in classical oratory, becoming a particularly favoured subject among Stoic philosophers. These thinkers often referred to his heroic struggles as profound allegories symbolising the need to curb human passions and bravely endure life's adversities. The Roman poet Seneca, for example, even argued that Heracles' immortality was achieved not through his divine parentage, but solely through his unyielding moral perseverance. Thus, each labour performed represented not merely an outstanding achievement, but also revealed a new, important facet of his multifaceted character. And so, through the crucible of fire and rivers of blood, under the heavens and in the embrace of rivers, with the strength of a lion and the art of the lyre, performing labyrinthine tasks, Heracles emerged from the trials transformed. He remained imperfect and still doomed, yet he was no longer fallen. Therefore, if eyelids have grown heavy and breath has slowed, one can find peace, remembering. Even the mightiest heroes sometimes have to clean stables or relentlessly pursue a deer through the forest for an entire year. For true strength, ultimately, manifests not only in physical might, but in the unwavering will to continue the path. Heracles didn't just survive his 12 labours. He completed them, and therein lies a profound difference. While survival often implies passivity, completion signifies clear intent, a conscious goal, and persistent effort to see something through. This quality, in essence, is what Heracles demonstrated to the world. He wasn't just strong, he was relentless in his pursuit. After atonement was complete, Heracles stood before the world no longer as a murderer in need of purification, but as a living legend. His name, once burdened with guilt and shame, now shone with mythical resonance. And yet, because this is Greek mythology, complete peace did not ensue. Instead, glory arrived. And glory, as it turned out, was a rather capricious and unpredictable beast. Heracles' story was by no means concluded with his famous labours. On the contrary, in many respects, they were merely a prologue to further events. The ancient Greeks, always fond of captivating sequels, filled his post-labour life with new deeds, fresh tragedies, and a deepening awareness that glory could be as heavy a burden as guilt. He returned to Thebes, but did not stay long. Whether due to oppressive shame, inner restlessness, or divine providence, he set out on his wanderings. And wherever Heracles went, new stories relentlessly followed him. He fought in battles, overthrew despots, and rescued maidens with the practiced ease of a man whose reputation already preceded him. It is safe to say that he was a pioneer among action heroes, an ancient equivalent of a wandering blockbuster. Among his many but lesser-known deeds, it is worth mentioning his participation in the war, between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. The Centaurs, as was often their wont, drank too much at a wedding feast and caused considerable mayhem. Heracles intervened, brandishing his club, and quickly dispersed them. It is important to note that the Greeks often used the image of centaurs to represent unbridled and wild passions. It is therefore highly symbolic that Heracles, a man constantly struggling with his own temper, was chosen as their opponent. Another legend transports him to Troy, long before the famous wooden horse appeared. The city at that time was suffering from a sea monster, and Heracles, passing by, as is often characteristic of heroes, offered to save it in exchange for a valuable gift, which often turned out to be a royal daughter. He defeated the monster, but was cunningly betrayed by King Laomedon. Naturally, Heracles returned later, besieged the city, and took his revenge. Greek myth is rarely elusive in its messages about honor and retribution. He also fought alongside Jason and the Argonauts for part of their journey, though his stay with them was brief. When his companion Hylas was abducted by nymphs, Heracles abandoned the quest for the Golden Fleece and set out to find him, wandering through the forest in deep sorrow. This moment stands out not so much for its drama as for the vulnerability displayed, the mighty hero broken by the power of attachment. Whether romantic or fraternal, the bond between Heracles and Hylas proved strong enough to halt even the pursuit of the Golden Fleece. These stories, though captivating in themselves, also served an important cultural function. They shaped the mythical landscape of ancient Hellas. Heracles was not tied to one specific place or a particular era. He was a pan-Hellenic hero, revered in many cities and worshipped in various forms. His image adorned temples in Boeotia, Argos, and even distant Sicily. He appeared on coins, in majestic statues, and on countless amphorae, usually depicted in mid-swing, with his lion skin flowing and beard proudly streaming in the wind. One story, often overlooked but particularly rich in symbolism, tells of Heracles challenging the river god Achelous for the right to marry Deianira. Achelous, capable of shape-shifting, fought Heracles, taking on various monstrous forms. At one point he transformed into a mighty bull. Heracles, unimpressed, broke off one of the bull's horns. This horn later became the cornucopia, a symbol of abundance and fertility. Thus, Heracles not only triumphed over a shape-shifting river god, but also accidentally bestowed upon humanity the most festive table decoration in history. In another story, he rescued Prometheus. Yes, the very Titan who was chained to a rock by Zeus for stealing fire and giving it to humanity. Prometheus suffered daily torment as an eagle devoured his liver, which miraculously regrew each night. Heracles, passing by, took aim and with a single arrow struck down the eagle. It was a moment of liberation, wrapped in an act of divine rebellion. This single gesture reconciled Heracles with the Titans, made him a saviour of human ingenuity, and subtly positioned him not merely as a servant of the gods, but as one willing to challenge them for a righteous cause. However, as his fame grew, so did the complexity of his relationships. Fame, as is known, tends to breed envy, misunderstanding, and political intrigue, especially when gods are involved. Consider his stay with Queen Omphale of Lydia. Yes, Queen, and yes, Heracles served her. According to myth, he was again punished, this time for killing a guest, a serious breach of xenia, the sacred law of hospitality. As atonement, he was sold into slavery and bought by Queen Omphale, who made him perform domestic duties. He wore women's clothing while she wore his lion skin. For the Greeks, this story was both humorous and unsettling. It overturned all expectations. Mighty Heracles embroidering with silk thread. But perhaps that was its deeper meaning. Greek myth often plays with duality, man and beast, god and mortal, male and female. Heracles' time with Omphale was not just a comical episode. It was a challenge to his self-identity. Can a man be strong and yet submit? Can a hero known for his ferocity find value in humility? In some versions, the answer is yes. In others, it's just another anecdote that kept Athenian playwrights busy. Then followed his marriages. Heracles was not monogamous by nature, nor according to the myths. After Megara, he married several more times, with Deianira being the most famous of his later wives. But before we get to that last tragic union, it's worth mentioning one of his most moving stories, the rescue of Alcestis. Alcestis was the wife of King Admetus. When Admetus was fated to die young, she volunteered to die in his place. Heracles, arriving at the house unaware of the grief, was shocked to learn what had happened. In a rare display of pure compassion, he descended into the underworld and wrestled with death itself, Thanatos, until Alcestis was freed. No labours, no commands, just a hero choosing to do good for the sake of another. He is also credited with founding cities, instituting festivals, and laying the groundwork for culture wherever he went. Some Roman sources claim he established the worship of Zeus in Iberia. Others say he dug wells, built roads, and taught people to train horses. The line between myth and civic propaganda, as is often the case, blurs. Heracles became both a god of strength and a symbol of order. Ironically, for one whose early life was defined by chaos, even the gods continued to interact with him. Athena remained his frequent helper, and Apollo, with whom he once quarrelled over a sacred tripod, eventually reconciled with him. This quarrel, incidentally, ended with Zeus throwing a lightning bolt between them. Quite divine, wouldn't you say? Majestic temples were erected in his honour. Festivals dedicated to his name were held. The Heraclea, a series of games and rites, were celebrated in many Greek cities, and later the Romans adopted him as Hercules Victor, patron of strength and military conquests. Statues depicted him not merely as a man of action, but as a burden-bearer, leaning on his club, with the weight of the lion skin hanging like a memory from his shoulders. He became an emblem, a symbol of the balance between glory and weariness. He was mortal, yet transcended mortals. He could fall into madness, yet rise to heroic heights. He could serve a queen in humility and yet be a terror to monsters. His legend grew not because he was perfect, but because he was not. He embodied contradictions. He embodied ourselves. And yet the story of Heracles was not yet complete. The great arc of his narrative still curved towards a final, fatal crescendo. Ahead lay the tragedy of Deianira and the poisoned cloak of love, turned deadly curse. And beyond that, the funeral pyre and the path to the stars. But that, dear reader, is a subject for another tale. For now, let us linger in this chapter of wanderings and glory. Let us rest by the roadside with the hero, sit under an olive tree and feel the dust of his journey, still warm in the wind. He has earned, if not peace, then at least eternal remembrance. Sleep soundly, knowing that even those with divine power must live with the full complexity of human existence. By this point, Heracles' labours had become less of a punishment and more of a profession for him. One could imagine the hero sighing over his cup of wine each evening, muttering, "What now?" as another impossible assignment arrived rolled in a scroll. Having completed 6 tasks, including wrestling a lion, dwelling in a swamp, and cleaning stables, one might think he deserved a well-earned rest. But no, King Eurystheus, ever eager to find fault, declared that 2 of the completed labours could not be counted. The Hydra, he argued, was a team effort, and the Augean stables, well, Heracles had accepted payment for them, and payment apparently nullified heroism. Thus, due to a bureaucratic punctiliousness that was firmly rooted in custom, the total number of great labours increased from 10 to 12. Notably, these last 6 trials could not be completed within a single day's journey. Instead, they required Heracles to travel far beyond Hellas, to mythical lands, long-forgotten corners of the world, and even to the murky gates of death itself. The first of these grand tasks involved capturing the Cretan bull, a creature of divine origin and a rather foul temper. This bull had once been sent by Poseidon, lord of the seas, to King Minos of Crete, on the condition that it be sacrificed in honour of the god. However, Minos, enchanted by its extraordinary beauty, and perhaps anticipating an addition to his personal menagerie, kept the bull for himself. As one might expect, such an act incurred Poseidon's wrath, who immediately drove the beast mad. The bull began mercilessly trampling fields, smashing massive walls, and breathing fire upon anyone who dared to look at it the wrong way. Heracles, for his part, subdued this ferocious creature with little difficulty. He sent it back to Eurystheus, who, upon merely glimpsing the furiously snorting bull, dove headfirst into his large bronze jar, a habit he regularly developed. Eventually, the bull was released and settled near Marathon, continuing to cause considerable trouble for other heroes. It seems mythological pest control was a constant occupation. The next assignment led Heracles to Thrace, a harsh land of cold winds and warlike tribes, where a particularly grim figure, King Diomedes, kept a stable of horses. Usually, horses were not cannibalistic creatures, but these were truly unique. Trained to devour the flesh of captives and enemies, Diomedes' mares were a terrifying innovation. Some traditions assert that they breathed fire, others that they were simply unnaturally vicious. In any case, Heracles was ordered to steal them. He set out with several companions and engaged in a fierce battle with the king's warriors. The culmination of this story is rather grim. Heracles, in a moment of stark practicality, fed Diomedes himself to his own horses. One might assume the moral was poetic justice, or, more cynically, the efficiency of ridding oneself of troublesome monarchs by feeding them to one's own carnivorous livestock. In any case, after this, the horses became considerably calmer. Eurystheus, predictably horrified, wanted nothing to do with them, and set them free. Then followed a rather awkward diplomatic mission. Eurystheus's daughter expressed a desire for the girdle of Hippolyta, the powerful queen of the Amazons. This girdle was not just an ordinary fashion accessory. It symbolized the queen's power and the divine favor that, according to tradition, Ares, the god of war himself, had bestowed upon her. Heracles approached the matter with initially commendable restraint. Hippolyta, impressed by his directness or perhaps captivated by his muscular physique, agreed to give him the girdle. But Hera, as always, had other plans. Disguised as an Amazon, she spread false rumors that Heracles intended to abduct their queen. Tension among the Amazons escalated to a fever pitch. The Amazons attacked. In the confusion, Hippolyta was killed either by Heracles himself, mistaking her for an attacker, or by her own kinswomen. Thus ingloriously ended what could have been a rare moment of peace. Heracles took the girdle and sailed home. One could almost hear him muttering, "It couldn't have gone smoothly, could it?" Then came the cattle of Geryon. This was quite a complex affair. Geryon was a three-bodied giant who resided on a distant island in the west, beyond the known world. His cows were of a particularly fine breed, tended by a herdsman, and guarded by a two-headed dog named Orthrus. Heracles, needing a means of transportation, borrowed a golden cup from the sun god Helios. Yes, literally a cup. And he used it to sail across the great Western Ocean. The Greeks, to their credit, were never shy about the grandiosity of a narrative. Upon arrival, Heracles dispatched Orthrus, then the herdsman, and finally Geryon himself, using arrows poisoned with the Hydra's venom, of course. After this began the long journey back, driving the cattle across continents, fending off raiders, thieves, and divine sabotages. Hera, still intent on making Heracles' life difficult, sent gadflies to scatter the herd. Heracles, exhausted but diligent, gathered them again. One might assume this was not his favourite labour. The penultimate trial led Heracles to the fabled Garden of the Hesperides, a true paradise at the edge of the world, where golden apples hung from trees, grown as a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera. These apples were not for mere snacking. They symbolized immortality and were guarded by the 100-headed serpent Ladon, as well as the nymphs, daughters of the evening star. Heracles did not know where to find this mysterious place, so he did what any mythical hero would do. He found a sea god, subdued him, and demanded directions. Eventually he turned to the Titan Atlas, who stood at the edge of the world, supporting the celestial vault. Heracles offered to take on this burden, just for a short time, if Atlas would be so kind as to fetch the apples. Atlas, unsurprisingly, agreed and fulfilled the request. But when he returned, he offered to deliver the apples himself, leaving Heracles to hold the heavens forever. Heracles smiled, nodded, and asked if Atlas could momentarily take back the weight while he adjusted his cloak. The Titan agreed. Heracles passed the burden and walked away with the apples. Never underestimate a man who fought a Hydra, cleaned divine stables, and negotiated with immortal skybearers. He had learned a thing or two. And then the last assignment, the final great labour. Heracles was commanded to descend into the underworld, not metaphorically, but literally, and return from there with Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of Hades. Unlike most of his tasks, this one did not involve theft, murder, or deceit. He had to ask permission. Heracles entered the land of the dead, past the shades of fallen heroes, and approached Hades and Persephone with what could only be described as exceptional manners. They agreed on one condition. He had to subdue Cerberus without the use of weapons. And he did, with only his bare hands and strength honed by 11 impossible tasks. Heracles subdued Cerberus and led him, snarling and snapping, into the world above ground. Eurystheus, by now well practiced in theatrical horror, reportedly fainted. Heracles returned the hound to his post at the gates of the underworld, unharmed and, probably, not overly impressed by the mortal realm. Finally, the 12 labours were complete. Heracles had faced monsters, gods, queens, and fierce beasts. He had travelled beyond all known maps and returned not only alive but purified of his sins. These trials, devised by a cowardly king and spurred on by a vengeful goddess, had made him something more than a mere mortal. His name would echo in temples, on amphorae, and in poetry, and eventually even in Saturday morning cartoons. But this, dear reader, was not the end of Heracles' story. Far from it. The labours had absolved his soul, but his mortal life would still be marked by struggle, sorrow, and ultimate transformation. For no Greek hero finds peace, not even the strongest of them. Heracles, having completed his 12 labours, by all rights should have retired. Perhaps a small olive grove, a modest villa, and a dog that didn't have 3 heads. But no, this was ancient Greece, where peace was merely a temporary state, and rest was for the dead. And even then, not always. The truth was, the labours were never meant to bring Heracles peace. They were atonement, punishment, perhaps even a public spectacle. 12 great efforts to wash the blood from his hands, yes, but not to ease his path forward. He had cleansed himself of the madness that led to the deaths of Megara and their children. But he was not free from the burden of fate, and so he remained strong, restless, and perhaps, deep down, a little lost. With his divine strength intact, and his name known across the Mediterranean, Heracles set out to wander. Not in the sense of lazily strolling through the sands, mind you, but as a tireless figure of myth and muscle. He became something between a mercenary and a demigod on retainer, hired by kings, revered by the desperate, sometimes feared by those who had reason to doubt his restraint. He fought in battles not included in his labours, in wars not sung in epic poems. He overthrew tyrants, hunted monsters, and even founded cities. Or so the stories go. It's hard, of course, to know where the real Heracles ends and the embellished myth begins. But perhaps that was always the point. He ventured far beyond mainland Greece into Libya, where, it is said, he overcame Antaeus, a giant who could not be defeated as long as he remained in contact with the earth. Heracles, with practical genius, lifted him into the air and crushed him. A beautiful metaphor, if you will, for learning to outwit even the most entrenched opponent. He travelled to Egypt, where one story claims a king Busiris tried to sacrifice him, but was himself sacrificed in short order. Heracles did not appreciate surprises. He travelled to the northern forests and the shores of the Black Sea, places where even Greek sailors whispered of cold winds and strange gods. He was, in many ways, the first truly Pan-Hellenic hero, a figure whose legend grew with every ship that left port and with every story told over wine. Local myths absorbed him like a sponge. In Egypt, he was associated with Heracles, a warrior god with strength and a regal bearing. In Phoenicia, he was associated with Melkart, and in Italy the Etruscans began to whisper his name in their own rights. The Romans, of course, fully appropriated him, Latinizing his name to Hercules and crafting his image as that of the empire itself, strong, noble, resilient, and always just a little too prone to violence. Even great heroes sometimes experience a deep sense of loneliness. This is what prompted Heracles to turn his gaze once more to the possibility of marriage. His attention was drawn to Deianira, a princess of Calydon, whose fame rested not only on exceptional beauty, but also on wit and a notable, vibrant independence. However, winning her hand proved no easy task. The princess already had another suitor, the river god Hercules, a deity capable of changing his form. He quite reasonably asserted his seniority, undeniable divinity, and a much smaller number of public scandals in his long history. But Heracles, never one to tolerate defeat in contests, immediately challenged him. They met in a duel, where they vied for strength and mastery of transformation. Hercules turned into a snake. Heracles gripped him. Then Hercules took the form of a furious bull, and Heracles broke off one of its horns. In time, this horn transformed into the legendary cornucopia, an eternal symbol of abundance. It is quite poetic that one of the most enduring images of harvest and feasting originates from the broken horn of a god defeated in a contest for a bride's hand. Heracles and Deianira married, and for a time peace reigned in their lives. They settled in Calydon, and it seemed the hero had found contentment for the first time. However, peace, as is often the case, proved fleeting. Conflict arose, as inevitably happens when mortal political interests and divine heritage intersect. The couple was forced to leave Calydon, embarking on a search for a new life in other lands. And it was during this transition that tragedy once again began to relentlessly pursue them. On the banks of a swollen, swift river, they encountered a centaur named Nessus. Nessus offered to carry Deianira across the turbulent current, while Heracles swam across independently. This was not out of the ordinary. Centaurs, though often wild, were sometimes used for such errands. But Nessus had far more sinister intentions. Halfway across the river, he attempted to abduct Deianira. Heracles, standing on the opposite bank, instantly realized what was happening. Without the slightest hesitation, he drew his bow and released an arrow. An arrow, as always, poisoned with the deadly venom of the Hydra. The arrow struck its target with impeccable accuracy. Nessus collapsed, mortally wounded, but with his last breath he managed to turn his own defeat into something far more insidious. He told Deianira in a calm, persuasive tone that his blood, now mixed with the bitterness of rejected love, could serve as a powerful amulet. If she ever doubted Heracles' fidelity, a cloak soaked in this blood would forever bind his heart to her. This, of course, was a lie. Nessus's blood was already infected with the same deadly poison that had killed countless monsters before him, but Deianira believed his words. Years passed. The couple settled in a new place. Heracles resumed his heroic wanderings, performing feats, collecting honors, and sometimes, as in the case of the young Princess Iole, expressing his admiration, perhaps too openly. Deianira, hearing whispers of his interest in Iole, panicked, but not from anger, but from deep sorrow, and the despair that only love and insecurity can breed. She remembered Nessus's instructions. She prepared the cloak as he had told her, soaked it in his blood, and sent it to her husband. Heracles, ever trusting, donned this gift. The very moment the fabric touched his skin, something terrible began, a pain unlike anything he had ever experienced, which is saying a lot, considering he once held the celestial vault on his shoulders. The poison acted swiftly, seeping into his flesh, burning not like flame, but like betrayal. He tried to tear off the fabric, but it would not release. The harder he struggled, the more harm it inflicted. His skin literally clung to it. His immense strength proved meaningless. In this tragic moment, there is something deeply human. The mightiest hero of myths was broken, and he was broken not by a monster or a blade, but by trust, by love, by the unintentional cruelty of one who wished him no harm. Heracles, realizing the inevitability of his end, ascended Mount Aeta. There he commanded the construction of a funeral pyre. No one dared to light it, moved by reverence or fear. Finally, a wanderer, sometimes called Philoctetes, a skilled archer, agreed to perform this mournful task. In gratitude, Heracles bequeathed him his bow, a sacred weapon destined to play a significant role in the Trojan War. And then the hero lay down, surrounded by wood, and silently awaited the flames. When the fire began to consume his mortal body, something truly astonishing occurred. His divine half, that essence inherited from Zeus, rose unharmed. He ascended to Olympus, shedding pain, memory, and the entire heavy burden of mortality. And there, in an event that could be called the most unexpected reconciliation in mythology, he was welcomed by Hera, the goddess who had persecuted him since birth, who had tried to kill him with snakes in his cradle, accepted him into the heavens and gave him her daughter Hebe, goddess of youth, as his wife. This seems like a very neat conclusion, perhaps even too neat. However, myth is meant to reflect not so much justice as profound meaning. Thus Heracles became a god. He was worshipped in sanctuaries throughout Greece and far beyond. Athletes offered him prayers for strength. Soldiers invoked his name in the heat of battle. Ordinary people facing adversity remembered that even Heracles had known suffering. He was no longer just a hero. He had transformed into a symbol of endurance, redemption, a long and arduous path from mistakes to forgiveness. His image was immortalized on vases, in temple carvings, in the minds of poets and orators. The Romans erected temples to him. The Byzantines later reinterpreted his figure. And even today, his story continues to echo in comic books, in images of muscular heroes on screens, in metaphors of impossible feats and inexhaustible fortitude. For Heracles fought not only the monsters of the external world, he waged an irreconcilable battle with himself, with his impulses, his anger, his guilt. And in the end, he emerged from that battle scarred, burned, perhaps even a little wiser, but having found inner peace. Not all heroes are crowned with laurel or olive leaves. Some receive their crown from flames. Some find paradise not through absolute purity, but through unwavering perseverance. Thus, his story leaves him not on the funeral pyre and not at the summit of Olympus, but somewhere in between. He is still moving, perhaps in the twilight lands of memory. He remains a figure embodying strength and sorrow, justice and delusion. His labors were complete, and his story remained an eternal reminder. The story of Heracles, it might seem, reached its divine apotheosis. He was granted immortality, solemnly welcomed to Olympus, and married Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth. This was a fitting end for a life woven from pain, mighty strength, and purifying fire. However, Greek myth was never particularly inclined to leave everything in a static state. Even the gods, it seems, knew no peace. And although Heracles ascended to the celestial halls, tales of his earthly deeds continued to spread, like the aftershocks of a long-forgotten earthquake. The fact is, the ancient Greeks did not confine their heroes to strict, neat narrative frameworks. They allowed them to evolve, contradict themselves, and reappear in new contexts. And so Heracles, having become a deity, remarkably remained involved in the mortal world. His cults flourished, his adventures multiplied, entire cities claimed his patronage, and in many places he was not just remembered. He was still perceived as an active hero who, despite his deification, never ceased his movement. This chapter, therefore, is not a single narrative, but rather a patchwork quilt of lesser-known stories that drift between pure myth and cult worship, between the whisper of legend and formal ritual. Heracles appears as an eternal wanderer, a god who could never sit still. Let's begin with a curious episode involving Heracles and Prometheus. Prometheus, you may recall, was having a rather bad time after stealing fire for humanity. Zeus, in a mood best described as perpetually displeased, chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. There, an eagle, huge, persistent, and presumably quite happy with its career choice, daily devoured his liver, which miraculously regrew each night. It was a divine punishment with a certain grim poetry. And then one day Heracles appeared. No grand motive is given. He was just passing by, as gods and heroes often do in these tales, and found Prometheus still chained, still bleeding, still waiting. Heracles, ever practical, took his bow and simply shot the eagle. One arrow. Then he broke the chains. Zeus, surprisingly, allowed it. Perhaps moved by the heroic act, or perhaps just tired of all the protracted drama. It's a striking episode. Heracles, the mortal turned god, freeing the Titan who once championed humanity. Two rebels briefly meeting at the edge of myth, one lifting the burden from the other. This is the kind of story that doesn't thunder on the page, but hums quietly, persistently in the memory. Soon after, Heracles found himself embroiled in another conflict. This time his adversary was a certain King Laomedon of Troy. The king, as is often the case with monarchs in Greek myths, was both proud and dishonest. He promised Heracles a generous reward, namely horses, if the hero would save his daughter Hesione from a sea monster. Heracles, of course, fulfilled his promise. He killed the monster, saved the maiden, but then was immediately informed that the reward would not, in fact, be paid. This was an unforgivable slight. Heracles returned later with an army, sacked the city, and killed Laomedon. In the midst of the chaos, he offered Hesione to her rescuer. She chose Telamon, Heracles' companion. Together they became the ancestors of Ajax, one of the greatest heroes of the future Trojan War. Thus Heracles inadvertently and indirectly helped set the stage for the conflict at Troy, not through prophecy or divine manipulation, but because he was cheated out of some promised horses, and he quite reasonably decided he had better things to do than tolerate royal ingratitude. In Lydia, a different tale unfolds, perhaps less full of drama, but no less instructive. Here the great Heracles found himself in unusual captivity, undergoing a very curious period of servitude. Traditions say he was sold into service to Queen Omphale. The motives for this event are presented in various versions. Some sources claim it was punishment for yet another murder, of which there were many in his life. Others lean towards the idea that the gods imposed a kind of penance on the unruly hero to teach him humility. Far more remarkable, however, is what happened during this time. Omphale, unlike many rulers of the Hellenic world, had no intention of allowing a demigod to run wild and destroy everything. She obliged him to work, and the nature of these tasks was completely unfamiliar to Heracles. He was to engage in spinning, weaving, and numerous household duties. In some narratives, the queen even donned his famous lion skin and carried his mighty club, while Heracles himself was forced to wear her clothes and jewelry. Undoubtedly, such a plot can be perceived as an amusing reversal of roles, and ancient vase painters undoubtedly delighted in playing with this motif. However, something deeper lies beneath, a process of softening. The hero, stripped of his usual tools, his wild temper, and his public image, appears before us in a new light. This offers a glimpse into the man hidden beneath the lion skin, or, more accurately, suggests that true heroism does not always have to be accompanied by thunder and noise. Sometimes it manifests in the most mundane tasks, such as neatly folding laundry. This story also serves as a reminder of the ancient Greeks' deep fascination with role-playing, with overturning the expected order of things, for the sheer curiosity of seeing what would happen. Omphale, a strong and far-sighted ruler, holds sway over the most powerful character in myths, and Heracles, still formidable, submits to her not out of weakness, but out of something very much akin to curiosity. Beyond the grand labours, there were also smaller yet surprisingly persistent events in historical memory that, being too insignificant for epic poems, refused to disappear without a trace. In some traditions, he assisted the Argonauts, though he did not complete their legendary voyage. His presence was also noted in Calydon, despite the central figures there being Meleager and the famous boar. It is known that he trained warriors, generously shared wise counsel with kings, and sometimes successfully resolved conflicts in Boeotia that no one else could handle. He is credited with founding the Olympic Games, though this same honour is disputed by Pelops and even Zeus himself. Nevertheless, the image of Heracles became firmly rooted in the cultural consciousness associated with Olympia. His majestic statues adorned gymnasiums, and wrestlers, filled with reverence, poured libations in his honour before crucial matches. He did not merely remain in memory, he was tangibly present, his spirit invoked in every sweat and every struggle for athletic glory. Over time, in the Roman world, he underwent an astonishing reinterpretation. Hercules, as he came to be known in Latin, ceased to be merely a rough wanderer haunted by guilt. He transformed into a civic hero, a patron of temple building, a vigilant protector of roads, and a benevolent guardian of trade. Merchants prayed to him for safe passage, soldiers marched beneath his effigies, and emperors proudly donned his iconography. Even Marcus Aurelius, the celebrated philosopher-emperor, expressed his admiration for him, describing strength and endurance in terms that clearly reflected the Heraclean model. However, this was an entirely different Heracles, polished, politically significant, smilingly immortalized in marble. The rough, impulsive man who once burned on a pyre was now a talisman of virtue and a role model. Then came the West, the Roman West specifically, where Heracles truly found his second birth. The Romans, known for their practicality and deep respect for useful deities, renamed him Hercules and elevated him to the rank of patron, not only of physical might but also of travellers, merchants and valiant warriors. He ceased to be merely a penitent sinner seeking to atone for his transgression. Now he embodied a symbol of virtues, active excellence, and triumph achieved through tireless effort. His legendary club was no longer associated so much with ruthless violence as with unwavering resilience. Temples dedicated to Hercules sprang up in Carthage, Spain, Gaul, and throughout Britain. Roman legionaries carved his name on altars located along Hadrian's Wall. Even far to the north, as far as the Rhine and Danube, his story continued to live. The Mediterranean hero was now conquering barbarian lands. He was not just a deity, but a powerful instrument of imperial policy. His deeds became vivid metaphors for imperial conquests. Just as Heracles tamed the wild world in his myths, be it a boar, a lion, or stables, so too did Rome envision the subjugation of untamed lands beyond its borders. However, even under the cloak of imperial grandeur, Hercules retained his multifaceted complexity. The Romans delighted in telling anecdotes about him, depicting him in taverns, sometimes inebriated, sometimes asleep, occasionally wrestling with pigs instead of formidable giants. He became paradoxically an object of genuine affection, more human and relatable than many of their distant, alienated gods. In Hispania, which encompasses modern Spain and Portugal, there is a tradition that Heracles founded Cadiz, and the Pillars of Hercules, two mythical rocks rising on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar, marked the edge of the known world. Non plus ultra, the inscription read, nothing further beyond. This served as a clear reminder that even the mightiest hero of legends has his limits. Then, perhaps by inevitable circumstance, Heracles gradually transitioned from the realm of revered deities to the sphere of narratives. As the mighty Roman Empire declined, Christianity gained strength and influence, and like many other pagan figures, Heracles was gently reinterpreted, not entirely rejected, but no longer revered as before. In medieval texts, he appeared not as a god, but rather as an instructive example. A mighty man, yes, but broken by his own vices, pride, lust, or anger. The very traits that once elevated him to heroic status now turned into a tragic fate. Nevertheless, he did not disappear without a trace. In the Renaissance, that grand revival of classical knowledge, Heracles returned with astonishing triumph. Artists depicted him with glowing skin, sculpted muscles, and a gaze directed upwards in stoic determination. Writers invoked his image in their Latin verses, and philosophers used him to assert the nobility of struggle. Michelangelo masterfully sculpted him, and Rubens captured him on his canvases. In Florence he became a symbol of civic valor, a mighty defender of the city against chaos, a kind of localized Hercules, if you will, with his unique Florentine style and political connotations. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers again turned to his figure, this time as a symbol of the triumph of reason over dark superstitions. The mythical Hydra became ignorance, and the Augean stables became the personification of corrupt institutions of church and state. The metaphorical meaning evolved, but the original form remained unchanged. And then, in the 20th century, something entirely different happened. Hercules went straight to Hollywood. His role was played by bodybuilders, Italian actors in sandals, and sometimes he appeared as an animated demigod accompanied by a singing satyr. He appeared in comic books and commercials. His name adorned gym signs. His immense strength became a marketing tool, and his labors became a convenient plot device. And yet, even there, beneath the muscles, naivety, and fanfare, something of the old Heracles remained. He was still imperfect, still amusing, and in his own way, still striving to do the right thing. He transformed into what each era demanded of him. He was a god in Egypt, a hero in Rome, a suffering saint in Byzantium, and then a cartoon in California. It is his astonishing adaptability that is the hero's true strength. It is not only his colossal power, but also his deep resonance, his ability to harmoniously fit into each new era, because at his very core he is not merely divine, but astonishingly, recognizably human. He appears as a person who made mistakes, lost control, felt regret for his actions, tried to correct his errors, sometimes succeeded, and sometimes did not. Thus, Heracles transformed not only into a myth, but into a kind of mirror. In his image, people can discern both their best and sometimes their worst qualities. In him, they see the burdens they carry on their shoulders and cherish the hope that one day they will be able to cast them off. His story reflects struggle, exhaustion, and finally, well-deserved peace. Therefore, when the name Heracles is uttered around the world, it does not merely point to the geographical points he touched with his presence. It is rather a tracing of how his image continues to remain relevant. He lives in philosophy, in art, in those unspoken metaphors whose use is not always consciously recognized. To call someone Herculean is not only to note their might, but also to emphasize their determination, perseverance, and ability to face challenges that others shy away from. And perhaps this is the most authentic of all his legacies. Not the temples, not the films, not the myths carved in fading marble, but precisely the profound idea that true strength lies not in the absence of difficulties, but in the ability to invariably face them head-on, quietly, relentlessly, and most importantly, with kindness. Thus, wherever one may be this evening, be it under bright electric lights or under the glimmer of ancient stars, one should realize that the hero who once battled giants now delicately awaits his place in one's personal story. And perhaps, when circumstances seem too burdensome to bear, one can remember him, and against all odds, still try. May rest come, for the world can wait. The next labor begins with the dawn. This night is for sleep. Stories have a way of ending, but not all of them depart instantly. Some fade gently like a flickering candle in the bottom of a glass. Others resonate so long that they seem to forget how to stop. And only a few, truly rare ones, continue their existence long after the last word has been spoken. Hercules, or Heracles as he was originally called, is one such immortal story. His journey began, like many Greek heroes, surrounded by deep contradictions. He was part divine and part human, born of a forbidden union between Zeus and a mortal woman. He was hated by the queen of the gods before he could even speak. Loved by many, but feared by even more, he was burdened with a mission of atonement through deeds so grand and difficult that they remained etched in human memory forever. The story of his life was traced through all these trials, snakes in the cradle, labours pushing the boundaries of the known world, moments of madness, battles with river deities and monsters, as well as grief itself, the poisoned cloak, the purifying fire, the ascent to Olympus, and the finding of restless peace. However, even after many chapters and thousands of words, a pressing question remains. Why does he continue to live? Not only within temple walls and on textbook pages, not only in the stanzas of epic poems or in the flickering frames of Saturday morning cartoons, but deep within us. Why is Heracles still present in our metaphors, in the names of our gyms, in our dreams, in our quiet internal dialogues? Reflecting on the greatness of Heracles, one might conclude that his true uniqueness did not stem from physical power alone. For mythological tales are full of examples of incredible strength. Titans held the celestial vault, Cyclopes effortlessly hurled colossal boulders, swift-footed Achilles astounded with his speed, cunning Odysseus surpassed all in mental agility, and Theseus displayed unparalleled courage. However, Heracles stood out among them with a special quality. His essence was defined not so much by what he was capable of, but by what he was obliged to accomplish, and, far more importantly, by what he steadfastly endured in the process of these achievements. The ancient Greeks never idealized the image of Heracles. He was known for his impulsiveness and unpredictability. In a fit of rage, he could commit murder when it was unacceptable. He did not shy away from tears in situations where others might maintain outward composure. He cried out for help, acknowledging his vulnerability. Heracles made mistakes, and he paid for his transgressions for many years. And yet, despite all his human weaknesses and falls, he invariably moved forward. It is this quality, unwavering perseverance, and not his legendary lion skin or mighty club, that is the true foundation of his immortal legacy. The ancient Hellenes had a specific term for this quality, karteria, which translates as endurance or fortitude of spirit. It was the ability to bear suffering with dignity, to withstand what seemed unbearable. It manifested in the ability to carry the burden of one's own mistakes, like a heavy sack of stones on one's back, and yet continue to climb the mountain of life. It meant cleaning the Augean stables when the unbearable stench permeated one's very bones, or engaging in battle with the multi-headed Hydra, knowing that for every head cut off, new ones would immediately grow. It was the willingness to undertake tasks that no one asked to be done, or to clear up the chaos left by others. And all this was accomplished not for the sake of glory or honour, but because these actions were necessary. Heracles, therefore, became the living embodiment of these profound ideas. He represented not a hero whose glory rests on ultimate victory, but a hero whose valour lay in the effort itself, in the endless striving towards a goal. Stoic philosophers perfectly understood this aspect of his nature. For them, he was not merely the embodiment of brute physical strength, but rather the personification of moral fortitude, an unwavering will. Although Marcus Aurelius, in his famous Meditations, does not directly mention Heracles, the spirit of the great hero is invisibly present in the emperor's admonitions. A man should build his life step by step, he writes, and be satisfied if each of these actions achieves its purpose to the greatest possible extent, and no one can hinder this. Such, in essence, was Heracles' life, not flawless, not easy, not without mistakes, but invariably persistent. In this unwavering persistence, something truly divine manifested, accompanying Heracles even in his death, or, as some prefer to say, in his apotheosis. The hero did not disappear into silent oblivion. He did not transform into a detached, distant deity, floating in unattainable clouds and serenely tasting ambrosia in boring omnipotence. On the contrary, he continued to be actively present in the world. He was addressed. He was invoked. In ancient Thebes, athletes poured fragrant oil on altars dedicated to his name, seeking patronage. Wrestlers, before a match, rubbed their hands, whispering prayers to him for strength. Soldiers adorned their shields with the image of a lion's head, not so much expecting unbreakable invincibility as invoking his spirit for courage and bravery. Merchants embarking on long and dangerous journeys left offerings before his sanctuaries. Even ordinary people, not kings, not valiant warriors, not wise philosophers, saw in him one who deeply understood the essence of hard labor and everyday trials. In this understanding lay great comfort, the thought that such a mighty figure was still capable of empathizing with human difficulties, that even deities once had to endure long days of exhausting labor and make difficult decisions, that true divinity can manifest not only in miracles but also in the monotonous repetition of effort, in unwavering resilience. Over time, Heracles' image also underwent significant changes, and this adaptability itself was part of his enduring strength. He transformed to meet the needs that people of different eras and cultures saw in him. For the ancient Greeks, he appeared as an imperfect mortal, constantly striving for self-improvement, for overcoming his weaknesses. In Roman culture, he embodied the image of Hercules, the mighty cousin of the empire, symbolizing civilization and unwavering confidence. For Christians of late antiquity, he became a kind of pagan penitent, a figure who atoned for his past transgressions through suffering and was transformed. In the Renaissance, Heracles was reborn, but now as the embodiment of the ideal man, strong in body, fearless in spirit, sometimes depicted nude in marble, but always majestically upright. In the modern world, he took his place as the archetype of the hero's journey, a universal narrative structure encompassing trials, personal growth, and triumph, even if the names of the characters changed. He was recognized in the images of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, Frodo, Luke Skywalker, in every hero who begins his journey unprepared, endures suffering, faces setbacks, learns lessons, and eventually, scarred but enriched with wisdom, achieves victory. Looking closely at everyday life, one can find his presence even where he seemingly goes unnoticed. He is embodied in the firefighter who bravely pushes through acrid smoke, saving lives. His spirit lives in the parent forced to work 2 jobs to support a family, and in the student who spends another sleepless night over textbooks, cherishing hope for a future that sometimes seems unattainable. He is present in the athlete who, despite defeats, gathers strength again and again for a new attempt, and in the heartbroken person who, slowly but surely, walks the path of healing. Heracles dwells not only among the mighty and invincible, he dwells among those who struggle, who overcome, and he has always been with them. For the myth of Heracles is not so much about our fantasies and dreams as it is about our deep exhaustion, about the weariness that accumulates in each of us. He seems to address the person, saying, "Yes, it is not easy. Yes, mistakes were made. Yes, you feel tired, but despite all this, keep going. Perform the next labor, fight the next beast, clean the next stables, try again. And if you fail, remember, even Heracles sometimes failed. The ancient Greeks, despite all their penchant for heroic drama, deeply and silently understood this truth. Temples dedicated to Heracles were often erected on roadsides, at busy crossroads, at city gates, in places where travellers constantly moved, burdened by long distances, concerns about trade, or gripped by fear of the unknown. These people offered prayers not just for physical strength, but for inner fortitude, for the ability to continue their journey, no matter what. They left oil as offerings, which served as a balm for tired muscles, and simple food. In their appeals, they asked for patience, for courage, for much-needed rest. And this phenomenon was observed not only in Greece, along Roman roads, in the squares of Spain and Gaul, on the wind-swept borders of Britannia. Everywhere his name spread. It was not associated with grand spectacles, but rather with quiet, unshakable reliability. Heracles transformed into a kind of spiritual companion for those on the road, a god not of thunderous rumbles and lightning, but of a tired yet encouraging nod at the end of an exhausting day. It is quite telling that Hercules was never known as a god of conquest, war, or kingship. His cult was associated with effort, with survival, with the image of a tired hero who steadfastly kept moving forward. In this image, there is something deeply human that resonates in every soul. Even his apotheosis, the process of becoming a god, is depicted not as the culmination of glory, but rather as an act of liberation. He is not carried to the heavens in triumphant chariots to the sound of trumpets. Instead, he burns his mortal flesh, tormented by unbearable pain, thereby revealing his divinity not as a crown of external glory, but as a quiet inner core that remained untouched when all that was transient disappeared. Ultimately, he becomes what he was always destined to be, not perfect, but absolutely whole. So, as the narrative of Heracles draws to a close, the question naturally arises as to what remains after him. Not the monsters, for they have long vanished. Not the labours themselves, for they were his personal ordeal. What remains is an overarching idea, the idea that a person is capable of facing the most incredible difficulties even when they seem utterly insurmountable. That true strength is measured not in fleeting glory, but in unwavering effort. That one doesn't have to be a god to matter. It's enough to simply keep going, and sometimes, importantly, to stop. To put down one's burdens, to rest by a warm fire, to eat, to drink, to sleep. Heracles undoubtedly would have understood this. He, more than anyone, earned his peaceful sleep, and now everyone who has listened to this story is also offered the opportunity to rest. Let eyes close and worldly worries dissolve. All labours are behind. The lion has long been tamed. The snakes are silent. The arrows are spent. The man is not broken. He is not falling behind. He is simply continuing his becoming. Like Heracles, like all of us, in this long, slow process of unfolding his own path. He is not alone. The stars that remember the great hero remember each of us too. May a peaceful night ensue, hero. May sleep be sound.